Now, the first and the most obvious question for React is, what is React? React is a front-end and open source JavaScript library which is used to build the single page applications. In React, everything is based off the components. If you see any website, let's say Amazon, we can break that Amazon into multiple components. So your first component would be the search bar, the header, the main section, the product card, the buttons, and whatnot. And these components are usable. Under the hood, React uses the virtual DOM, which makes it so powerful, which helps React in efficiently updating and render just the right component when your data changes. And React code is written in JSX. What is the virtual DOM? React keeps a lightweight representation of the real DOM in the memory, and that is known as the virtual DOM. This is different from the real DOM. We will discuss about the real DOM in a while. The aim of the virtual DOM is to update only that piece of the UI that has actually changed instead of the entire page. These are the differences between the real DOM and the virtual DOM. As you can see, real DOM is slower than the virtual DOM. Real DOM consumes more memory, whereas virtual DOMs consumes less memory. Operations are expensive in real DOM. In virtual DOM, operations are very easy and not expensive. Real DOM, we can directly update the HTML. In virtual DOM, we cannot. It creates a new DOM if elements update, whereas the virtual DOM updates the JSX if the element updates. Next question is, what are the components in React? As you already discussed, React is all about the components. So we have two kinds of components in React. One is functional and one is class components. I recommend to use functional components wherever possible. But if we talk about prior to the hook's introduction, then functional components were also called stateless, dumb, and presentational components because they do not have any way to store the state of the component. They were just pure representational components. They only care about how your UI looks like. And the class components prior to the hook's introduction, also called smart components, because they can hold their own state and they can have the lifecycle methods and all the business logics and everything. Next question is if which to use when. So if the component needs state or lifecycle methods, then class components, otherwise use functional component. This statement was true before the introduction of before the hooks introduction, but now it is always recommended to use functional components unless you need a React functionality whose function component equivalent is not present yet, like error boundaries. So it means wherever possible, use the functional component. And if you find some use case which cannot be fulfilled with the functional component, then only go for the class component. Next question is how to pass the data from one component to another. In React application, we need to pass the data from parent to child and child to parent. Let's talk about parent to child data passing. We can use the props to pass that. And for child to parent, this is a bit tricky. We have to create some callbacks, and then that callback is passed as a prop. And whenever this callback method is called, that will get the data back to the parent component from the child component. What are pure components? Exactly same as the other the normal components, except it handles the should component update method for you. What does it mean? It means the pure components automatically takes care whether your component should update or not. It will only re-render the component if a probe or if a probe or state has really changed. Otherwise, it would not re-render the component, and that increases the component performance. Next question is, What are controlled components? Controlled components is one that takes its current value through props and notifies changes through callbacks like onChange, also called dumb component. Uncontrolled component is the one that stores its own state internally, called the smart component. We have two types of components in our React application. One is component and one is container. Container usually holds the state of the application, and component describes the presentational part of your application. The different phases of a lifecycle component. Every React component goes through these lifecycle methods from mounting to unmounting. We have constructor, get type statement probes, should component update, the render method, get snapshot before update, component did mount, component did update, component will unmount. You can read more about it in the React documents. State is the brains of the React application. State is a built-in React object that is used to contain data or information about the component. It can change over time, and whenever it is changed, the component gets re-rendered. It is responsible to determine the behavior of the component and how it will render. Next question is, how do you update the state? To update the state, we have a built-in method called setState. Should we update the state directly? It means, do we always need to use the setState method to update the state, or we can update it directly? The answer is yes, we should always use the setState method to update it. Otherwise, the proper re-rendering of the components will not happen. Updating state in React. When several components need to share the same changing data, then it is recommended to lift the shared state up to their closest common ancestor. This means if two child components share the same data from its parent, then move the state to parent instead of maintaining local state in both of the child component. Next question is, what are props in React? Props are short for properties. Props provide a way to pass the data from one component to another component. If you have some data in component A and you want to pass the component in the data in component B, you can pass that via props. And this is the syntax to pass the data via props. Here, ID, value, and onChange are the props to this input component. Now we have discussed about what is state and what is props. Now let's discuss what are the differences between these two. State are immutable, means they can be changed. Props are immutable. It holds information about the component, allows to pass data from one component to other component as a prop. Stateless component cannot have state, but they can have props. Stateful components can have state, cannot have props. Next question is, what is JSX? JSX stands for JavaScript XML. It allows us to write HTML in React. Without using JSX, we would have to create elements using React.createElement, which is a very cumbersome process. What are React features, or why React is so popular? There are so many reasons why React is popular. It uses CSX, it uses virtual DOM, the one-way data binding. That means data can only be passed from parent to child. It has high performance. It has this components concept, which is the building block of any React application. It is SEO friendly, gentle learning curve, and use ecosystem. What are the limitations of React? React is not a full-blown framework, as it is only a library. Coding might become complex as it will make use of inline templating and JSX. It might be difficult for the beginner programmer to understand React. How React is different from the Angular. React's biggest competitor is Angular. Angular is authored by Google, whereas React is authored by Facebook. React is a library, Angular is a framework, React uses virtual DOM, Angular uses real DOM. That's why React is faster as compared to Angular. React has unidirectional data binding, Angular has bidirectional data binding. React is a view layer of MVC, whereas Angular is the complete MVC. Next question is ES5 versus ES6. ES stands for the ECMAScript. That is, ES5 is the fifth edition of ECMA International, whereas ES6 is the sixth edition of ECMA International. ES5 we have only var keyword, whereas in ES6 we have let and const. ES6 is more performant than ES5. We can use arrow functions in ES5. Next question is, what are the different ways to style a React component? We have four different ways to style any React application. We can use the inline styling, the CSS style sheet, the CSS modules, and the JavaScript object. These two are the preferred way and the recommended way, the CSS style sheet or the CSS modules. Next question is, what is prop drilling in React? There are times when data from a top level component need to be passed to a component that is deeply nested. So here, data from component A needs to be passed to the component 6. That can be achieved using the prop drilling. We will pass the data to component 2 from 1, and then to component 4, and then to component 6. The disadvantage of this, the data which is required only by the component 6 is also shared with component 2 and 4. Next question is, what is there a need for using keys in list? Key is a unique identifier and it is used to identify which items have changed, been updated, or deleted from the list. It helps React to decide which element needs to be re-rendered. It increases the performance. Next question is, how to prevent re-renders in React? One way is we can use this should component update lifecycle method, and we can return false on basis of some conditions, which will save us from unnecessary re-rendering. We can provide keys in every list item. Next question is, what are error boundaries? They are introduced in 16th version of React. Provides a way for us to catch errors that occur in render phase. Next question is, what is strict mode in React? It's a tool that highlights the potential problems in an application. It identifies components with unsafe lifecycle methods. So you might have a third-party library which is using some deprecated lifecycle methods. With the help of strict mode, you can identify that. Next question is, what is higher order component or HOC? It acts as a container for other components. It helps to keep components simple and enables reusability. They are generally used when multiple components have to use same common logic. Redux connect method is an example of HOC. Next question is, how do you optimize React app performance? We have different ways to achieve the higher performance. We can use lazy loading, the pure component, the use memo hook, and the state collocation. Next question is, what is React Router? It's a library for routing in React. It allows us to build a single page web application in React with navigation without even refreshing the page when the user navigates. So you must have seen in Amazon or Flipkart, whenever you click any category, it takes you to that category and it changes the URL. That is basically your routing. Possible with these features of router that are browser router, routes, route, link, and you can pass the data between sibling component of the React. That is possible using React router with the help of history.push and history and match node params. Next question is how to perform automatic redirect after login. The React router package has a redirect component in React router. This redirect component will navigate to a newer location. Next question. What are hooks in React? They are introduced in React 16.8. It allows to use all React features without writing class components. So with the introduction of hooks, we can manage the state and use the lifecycle methods in a functional components also. Hooks does not work inside class component. Next question is explain hooks in React. We have two types of hooks in React. One is built-in hooks and custom hooks. Custom hooks are created by the developers as per their requirement. Whereas built-in hooks are further segregated into categories. One is basic hook and one is the additional hooks. We have use state, use effect, use context, use reducer, use memo, use callback, etc. Next question is what is the purpose of use effect hook? Use effect hook let us perform side effects in a functional component. It can replace many lifecycle methods, component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. Next question is differentiate use callback and use memo. Use callback returns a memoized callback. It gives you referential equality between renders for functions, whereas use memo returns a memoized value and it gives you referential equality between render for values. So use callback is for the memoized callbacks and use memo is for memoized value. That is the only difference between these two. Next question, what are hooks rules? They can be used only in the functional component. You should not call hooks from regular JavaScript functions. They can be used at the top level of your React function. You should not call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. Next, differentiate React hooks versus classes. Hooks can be used in the functional components, whereas classes can be used in the class component. They are the performance hooks performance is high because instance creation, binding of events, etc. are avoided, whereas classes performance is low because more amount of work to be done by React. Next, what is the use of ref? Ref is used to return a reference to the element. They should be avoided in most cases. Next question. What are synthetic events in React? Is a cross-browser wrapper around the browser's native event. Next question is what is React Fiber and its goal? It's a completely backward compatible rewrite of old reconciler better support for the error boundaries. Next question, what is Shadow DOM? It's a browser technology designed primarily for scoping variables and CSS in web components. Next, what is the difference between React and React DOM? Both are packages. React package contains React.create element, React.component, React.children, whereas React DOM package contains React DOM.render and React DOM server dot render to string and static markup. Next question, what is Redux? Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript apps based on the Flux design pattern. It is a giant object sitting at the top of your application, which contains state of your application, and that state can be accessed by any components of your React application. Actions, reducers, and store are its building blocks. Next, what are the core principles of Redux? It has a single source of truth, that is a single store. State is read only, and every state is changed when an action is emitted, and that action pass the data to the reducer, which actually goes to the store and changes the data. Next, map state to props versus map dispatch to props. Both are the utilities. Map state to props helps your component get updated state, whereas map dispatch to props will help your component to fire an action event. Next, differentiate Redux Saga and Redux Thunk. Okay. Next, differentiate Redux Saga and Redux Thunk. Redux Thunks and Redux Saga take care of dealing with side effects. In most of the scenarios, Thunk uses promises to deal with them, whereas Saga uses generators. Saga is more powerful, but you will need to learn them. There is a learning curve. Next, what is Flux? Flux is an application design paradigm used as a replacement for the more traditional MVC pattern. Here you can see we have an action, dispatcher, store, and view. Facebook uses these patterns internally when working with React. Next, differentiate Flux and Redux. Flux is mutable, that means it can be changed. Redux is immutable. Flux can have multiple stores, whereas Redux has a single store. In Flux, we have a singleton dispatcher, whereas in Redux, there is no concept of dispatcher. So that's all, guys. I think you have enjoyed the video and learned something new.